The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales radio show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales radio show with me, Charles Christian. Thank you for tuning in again for more Weird Tales in Weird Times. This week we have part one of a two-parter looking at one of this show's perennial favourites, Aleister Crowley, but this time in his role as a British spy. Was he really Secret Agent 666? But first, television. There's a new TV series available on Amazon Prime called Truth Seekers. All episodes are available now, so you can binge watch if you like, which is what I did. It stars and was created by Nick Frost and Simon Pegg, who some of you will recall were the creators and stars of the Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy of movies, Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz and The World's End. Although American listeners will probably be more familiar with Simon Pegg for his roles in Mission Impossible and the rebooted Star Trek movie series. So, back to the Truth Seekers. It is a comedy and it's based around Nick Frost's character. He plays a broadband internet installer who also dabbles, unsuccessfully, as a paranormal investigator, complete with his own YouTube channel that nobody watches. I found the series great fun, but be warned, it does parody and make cruel fun of the paranormal investigation TV scene. And of conspiracy theories like 5G and cosplay and sci-fi conventions and the aliens are going to save us doomsday cults. Oh, and it's also quite rude about social media influencers, which is possibly why I liked it, though I have noticed the paranormal research community on Facebook seem to be giving it the thumbs down, possibly because the humour is a little too close to home. Anyway, The Truth Seekers, available now on Amazon Prime. And while we're still on the subject of Amazon Prime, did you know that in medieval times eels were not only a major part of most people's diet in Europe, but that you could also use eels as money, with people paying their bills, rents and even taxes in eels. In England, 25 eels were called a stick, while 10 sticks of eel were called a bind. And according to my calculations, taking into account inflation and the changing value of money, one bind of eels, or 250 eels, would today buy you a year's membership of Amazon Prime. That's a thought to take home with you. Right, now for this week's interview. We are talking to Richard Spence, Dr. Richard Spence, I should add, who is a professor of history at the University of Idaho. He specialises in Russian intelligence and military history, and his university course offerings include modern espionage, the history of secret societies, and the occult in history. He's appeared on various History Channel documentaries, and he's a consultant to the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. His books include Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley, and Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult. We're talking about Aleister Crowley and the fact that, among many other things, he may have tipped the scales to ensure that the United States entered World War I on the side of the Allies. Here's the interview. Right, now we've got a lovely topic here, Aleister Crowley. We love him on this show. The only thing I always have to remember is he's Crowley. People in Scotland get very annoyed if I call him Crowley. But, he's a fascinating character, and I think one of the things about him is that a lot of people only know him from his later years when he was basically a bald, bloated drug addict and living in poverty on the south coast in England. But he actually had a hugely exciting life, starting with his mountain climbing and various magical exploits, and then his activities in World War One, where he generally, though obviously everything he says you have to take with a pinch of salt, but he worked as a double agent in the United States against German sympathizers, I believe.
Well, that's the simple way of putting it. It's probably, as with everything else with Crowley, it's complicated to some degree. But yeah, he is. Well, I can actually read part of a U.S. Army Military Intelligence Division, which was the chief agency for internal security back in 1918.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is fairly late in the war.
Yeah.
And at this time, the Americans, having entered the war, were getting sort of suspicious of this guy who they knew who had written, he'd blatantly written for a pro-German publication called What Else? The Fatherland. And look, if you're going to have a pro-German publication, that would be it. And he had written, pointedly anti-British articles for a German publication. And so they were actually thinking about arresting him. So they inquired first to the British consulate in New York. And here's basically what the report says, or the point, the whole reason that I became really interested in Crowley was because of this single statement. It was determined that Aleister Crowley was an employee of the British government at present in this country on official business of which the British consul, New York City, has full cognizance.
Hmm.
All right?
Yep.
So the significance of that statement to me was that Crowley's later statements in the 1920s and on, he would often he would find himself in distress.
Yes.
And then he would say something about, I'd actually, all this business about me being a traitor during the war wasn't true. I was actually, serving His Majesty's interests. I'm actually a loyal British subject. And that's, even by many of his, let's say, fans later on, that was often assumed to be a, exaggeration or an outright lie. But the point is that from the, MID end, he was there. He is an employee of the British government in this country on official business. And that then got me, well, what's the official, what's he doing?
Mm.
So when he says he's working for the British government in the U.S. during World War I, they just said that's true. Then it becomes a matter of trying to determine what that was. Then you're kind of off to the races once you go into that. But it does make, it's one of those things I found in other areas of research that sometimes, it's trying to figure out what makes somebody tick. It could be Crowley, it could be Riley, it could be Jack Parsons. And usually the persona that someone presents to the world, especially if they're in the public eye, is a different one from what they are in private. That's no great revelation, I suppose. Mm-hmm. We're all slightly different people in public than we are in private. And so the tricky part is often trying to figure out which of these different versions of this person, what's the act and what's the real person. And that's one of the things that I think fascinated me about Crowley. And he turns out to be, to no great surprise, multifaceted. I think when he was saying that he was a perfectly loyal British subject, that's absolutely what he was, in his own peculiar way, perhaps. And that was one of the terms often connected to him, let's see, who was it? I think it was some press baron who dubbed him the wickedest man in the world, the man we'd love to hang. He himself, when you nickname yourself the Great Beast, I think you're asking for trouble.
Yes.
And Well, I mean, his mother actually apparently named him that, but then he embraced it and advertised it. And so this whole, you can sort of see this transition going through when, when horrifying, let's say, the Edwardian public was something that, as a younger man, he, took a certain pride in,
Yes.
offending moral sensibilities and, making respectable people afraid of him.
Yes.
But the thing is, of course, as other people have figured out, that has a certain cost. And it's one thing to earn a reputation. It's another thing to then later off try to slough off that reputation.
Yes.
And that's something that I think really, by the time we get to the 1930s, when his life really sort of begins this kind of, as you said, he ends up basically living, if not in absolute poverty, then in not in the best of circumstances, a hopeless heroin addict, and pretty much a kind of forgotten character. I mean, Crowley's much better known today.
Yes.
Than he was, let's say, when he died in 47, or even in the last decade or so of his life. There were relatively few people who paid much of attention to him. Oh, that's that old horrid guy who used to do shocking things. But he makes these attempts to try to redeem his reputation. I mean, he eventually, I think, comes to the conclusion in the early 30s that he's got this wickedest man in the world traitor thing hanging over his head. And he does try to, cultivate people in the press or elsewhere who could help turn that around. He's not very good at that. And the problem, he's no good at PR. The other thing that he's terrible at is managing money.
Yes.
Right. This is, there was someone who once said that the two things he was friends with Crowley, but the two things he would never do regarding him was to loan him money or leave him alone with his children, which I think would probably be, apparently because he told them scary stories. Who would have thought that? But, and I can sympathize with that because I've been accused of doing exactly the same thing. And it's true. I have told children scary stories.
Good for you.
So,
we like that.
I think it's all part of their growth.
It is character building.
Yes, parents are just overprotective.
Yeah.
But Crowley wasn't particularly good at public relations, and he could never throw that out. And part of it was because the wickedest man in the world, horrible occultist, just sold better. It's the type of thing. I think you probably
people
know
would
how
pay
it
good
goes.
money to have that on their reputation.
Yeah, at least you're famous for something. You're famous for being horrible. Yeah. It's the old thing is that there's the truth and there's the good story, and the good story will almost always prevail over the truth.
Yes.
As way too many, I think, celebrities have found out that once you get this attached to you. So it was one of those things that I think initially he sort of, really took, again, as a kind of pride in this, that he was horrifying, but that he had this kind of reputation. But then it was one that, seriously limited, I think it, the perception of anyone of him. It also meant the other problem is that one of the things he could do to try to throw off that image was, would be to actually reveal. I mean, you have to imagine if he'd have been able to write a book on his own, which probably wouldn't have been half bad, revealing his wartime activities on behalf of the British government, that could have helped. But of course, that's the thing you can't talk about.
Yes.
And that is one of those things which is, one of the realms of research I have is, intelligence generally. And I would say that that's one of the things that you have to take very seriously in that realm is you do not talk about these things without some kind of official permission, which is very, very rarely given. And if you do start talking about things that you're not supposed to talk about, the wrath of God or something will descend upon you. And that was something. And you could see him occasionally. He'll make these statements. He'll mention, the name of someone that he dealt with, and you can see him sort of playing around with this, how far he could push the envelope. But then there's almost always a kind of slap on the wrist or whack on the head to sort of bring him back into line.
Yeah.
And that, I think, I have to admit that I think that while he was probably fair to say a wretched human being in any number of ways, aren't we all, that his reputation that he has today is his reputation for horridness is exaggerated somewhat.
Yes.
It's again, I probably wouldn't loan him money or leave him alone with my children, but I think he would be a fascinating guy to talk to. He wasn't just this this kind. The idea, for instance, here's the whole issue of that Crowley is the arch Satanist of the 20th century. He's probably the arch occultist of the 20th century, but I don't think he could ever honestly be described as a Satanist. There's no point where he actually worships the devil. There are probably some questionable things that he was involved in, but I don't think that's part of it. The interesting key to him, that you and probably a lot of your listeners already know, is that he was raised in what we would now call a Christian fundamentalist household. Very strict, the Plymouth Brethren.
Yes.
I can't do them justice except to say that they're one of those sects, of which there are many, that believe that they will go to heaven and everyone else will burn in hell.
Yeah.
Very sort of strict upbringing. His father, spent most of his time as a kind of lay minister for the sect, and but to me, that was a kind of insight into Crowley's personality, because you grow up in a family that has a very strong religious element to it. And your father, who he greatly admired, his father died when he was, I think, around 10 or 11 years old. And he seems later on to have kind of idealized his father. And his father was a preacher. He was a preacher of the gospel. And Crowley, in his own way, what does Crowley go on to do? He goes on to essentially found his own religion and to proselytize it. So in a sense, he follows in his father's footsteps. He rejects the Christian fundamentalism of his upbringing, but then he creates attempts to create his own kind of fundamentalism. Rather than being part of somebody else's church, you form your own. Form your own. But there's this common theme of spirituality. His father was searching for God. Crowley, in his own particular way, is searching for God. By the time he dies, though, I'm not sure he believes he's found him. And that becomes another one of these things, which I think is, not to put too much of a spin on it, is slightly tragic about him. I think he's a fascinating guy.
Yeah, his latter years really are sad. It's sort of classic fiery comet in his youth and then crashing and burning in his later years. It is sad, his later years. But it's also fascinating how he managed to burn through. He came from a wealthy family, and it's one of the things that kept him going, wasn't it? He had a private fortune, and he managed to get through it in remarkably quick time.
Yes, he was very good at spending money. He wasn't good at making it. The family's money came from, I think, brewing, which was kind of interesting. And also apparently his father dabbled in real estate, I found out. He bought and sold houses. So they weren't, I don't know, filthy rich, but they were well off. He also had some other relatives. He had an aunt, Annie, who he was very fond of, who was kind of like this, ersatz mother, because he didn't get along with his mother. And so she had money as well. So he had money. I think, towards the end of the First World War, around 1917, I think his mother dies, and so he inherits part of that estate. And he blew every penny of it. Yeah. So, not a businessman in any sense of the word. And that's another, the other thing that sort of contributed to his decline is, it's his reputation. It's also, he was again, he would borrow money from people and not pay it back. He would quarrel. One of the things they frequent. He had very few people who he could still call his friends. Towards the end, they became fewer and fewer and fewer. And I think also, we all may know someone like this. Someone who you kind of love and admire them in certain ways, but the other part of it is that they're just they're trouble. All right.
Yeah.
They're just a gigantic pain. They're always, sponging, and you tolerate those things in them. And I think some people could tolerate him and some people couldn't. Selfish and demanding. I'm not even sure how far here we want to go into his relationships with women, which were, almost always ended badly.
Yes.
And this was one of the arguments I heard about him is that, every woman he was connected to went mad, right? Which is not exactly true, but some of them did. And so the idea being is that, well, obviously it's him. He drove them mad, being this, monstrous, satanic, grotesque ogre of a person. He drove them crazy. I'd say that probably the ones that, ended up in asylums were pretty much halfway there before he met them.
Yeah.
So it may have more to do with the people he was attracted to than anything else. But yes, he was not a man for stable relationships. Although, there too, I think his first wife, he married, around the turn of the 20th century, Rose Kelly. And they, there you sort of get this other sort of taste of the tragedy, I think, that sort of dogged him throughout his life, which was he sort of drew, as he became more and more interested in the occult, he drew her into it. She sort of became his medium. She also became an alcoholic. And through a lot of very, very poor decisions, he took her and their very young child on a trip to the Far East, and that ended up with the child dying. While in her mother's, I don't know what possessed him to put, his wife and his child on a ship on their own, and the child died. But that was one of those things that if you look through some of his writings, I mean, really, that he didn't slough that off. That was very, very painful to him. And I don't think that he ever, it's always too much to say that people never recover, but it changes them in some respects. Yeah. I think it's one of those things that sort of affected his relationships with women, marriage, family, the whole business thereafter. And he did have other children, most of them illegitimate, that followed along, but never seems to have been particularly close to any of them. I was fascinated to find out that he actually had a daughter by one of his mistresses, I think in the early 20s, who died in the San Francisco Bay Area around 2014. Mm-hmm. And I was even more curious about that because she and I had lived in the same town for a while. Yeah. So, so I never thought, I was living here in those years, and there was a daughter of Aleister Crowley there. Who knew that? And she was, was a perfect, she eventually became a kind of church lady. I don't know. She just reverted to the family archetype, I suppose. Yeah. And married, very nice, respectable, middle-class woman, member of a church club, garden club, and the rest of it. Changed, her last name was never Crowley. I will say that she did look like him, however. So, That, by the way, was all connected to this story that you may have heard about Barbara Bush being Aleister Crowley's daughter.
Yes.
All right.
It's a good one, that.
It's a good story, and I got to say, but here it is just not true, all right? It's not true. And I'm not saying that because I'm some great fan of Barbara, but it's just, it is, there's no there, folks, all right? But it's... And I actually was doing an interview like this where someone called in, and I'd never heard that before, and sort of, just sort of sprung this question, what about Barbara Bush being his daughter? It's like, what? And but then that was how I eventually found that he really did, have a daughter around the same age, interestingly enough, but not Barbara Bush. I want to emphasize that again. So...
Yeah, But I mean, all of this then adds to the point of why did British intelligence recruit him? Well, admittedly, he wasn't quite so notorious in the early years, but it makes you think, why did he get involved? Why did they employ him?
Well, from his side, look at it this way. Let's go back to something you mentioned earlier on. In his early career, really up pretty much of the First World War, he was a mountain climber, an alpinist.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's, let's say, an adventurous side to him. And I think that even sort of translates over into his interest in the occult. I mean, you know, if you're going to try to summon Barzabel, the spirit of war, then there's certainly an adventurous side to you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, not everyone is going to try that. In the same way that not everybody is going to try to climb K2. So on the one hand, to him personally, there has to be this kind of hook into the person. And part of it is that, you know, one of the things that intelligence agencies often look for and engage in people they recruit is whether or not this person is, you know, has the right sort of mettle for it. You know, you have to be kind of adventurous, not exactly reckless, but you have to be willing to do things that most people wouldn't do.
Yes.
I don't know. There's some. It might be a John Le Carre book, but he says that someone is recruiting him, and he says, "Look, you have to be willing to do two things if you're going to go into this. You have to be willing to lie, and you have to be willing to kill. You may not ever have to do that, but you have to be willing to do it, and you can't be squeamish once you go on." Aleister Crowley, I would argue, was not squeamish.
Yes, that's fair.
Yes. I mean, there may have been some things. I don't know how he felt about spiders, for instance, but at any rate, he wasn't, you know, he had the sort of right psychological makeup that this would appeal to him. Now, the other reason, why would you go, I mean, while he didn't have the same reputation he has today, let's say back in 1914, he had a reputation. And it generally wasn't a particularly good one. And what he wanted, what he actually was hoping for when the war broke out, and he came back to London hoping that he would get, is that he wanted a commission. And he wanted a commission particularly in something called the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, the RNVR, which was essentially a kind of, you know, it mostly recruited what might be called gentlemen, although I'm not sure if they all were. It was only generally for people who had no particular prior military experience to serve in the war, and it was one of the things I found. It was a prime recruiting ground for intelligence.
Yeah.
So if you were looking for people who had, let's say, particular language skills that you might not have needed before, that would be, you know, who speaks Albanian? Well, here's someone who does, and you could give them a commission within the RNVR.
Yeah.
And that's what a friend of his had received. And so the guy who kind of segues him into intelligence is a fellow who he'd been friends with for years, a fellow by the name of Everard Fielding. And he and Everard Fielding had been buddies for a time, and they'd both been connected to a thing called, Fielding was closely connected to an outfit called the Society for Psychical Research, which was a kind of paranormal investigative agency. You know, pretty respectable. Carried out some serious investigation. Crowley was kind of a consultant. I'm not sure he would ever actually join the organization, or they would let him in, but he would consult. And much of their work was, you know, sort of checking up on mediums. Yeah, was one of the things they would do. So he knew Fielding, and Fielding, you know, goes into what? He goes into the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, and Crowley did not get that. See, that's one of those things that would have been, you know, more respectable in some ways. But, you know, what Fielding said is that, we have something else that you can do. And what that's connected to is one of these things that, well, you know, it's a long story, and it's difficult to make the long story short. But the thing that made Crowley attractive, in this case, to British naval intelligence. That's one of the things to keep. So it's one of the things to keep in mind is that when you're talking about intelligence, whether it's British, American, or whatever, it's a house of many rooms. which means that it's not just the CIA and it's not just MI6. It's a variety of other agencies. And really, I'd say in the First World War, the premier, probably in this way, the kind of oldest, most established, and maybe most efficient intelligence agency wasn't what would become. It wasn't yet MI6, but was the Naval Intelligence Division.
Mm-hmm.
And they had use for him because of Crowley's connections to occult societies, and which were in turn linked to German occult societies.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
So, for instance, back before the war, around 1910, 1912, a few years before the war broke out, Crowley made the acquaintance of a German who was living in Britain at that time, a fellow by the name of Theodor Reuss. And Theodor Reuss he was a journalist, worked for German newspapers. He was a very avid occultist, and he was the head of something which called itself the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That's still around today, although there are different branches. And I wouldn't want to draw too close of a comparison between the OTO as it existed in 1912 and the OTO as it exists today. So let's say the brand name is still around, but I'm not sure the product is the same.
Yeah.
But the OTO was in its origins entirely a German initiatory occult order. In fact, it was an occult order that wanted to combine lots of other ones sort of under its umbrella in some regards. And Reuss initiated Crowley into that, again, around 1912, let's say, and anointed him the head of the OTO, basically for the English-speaking world. Now, but Theodor Reuss wasn't just a journalist and an occultist. Oh, no. He was also worked for, guess what? German intelligence. Okay.
Ta-da!
And ta-da! All right. So he's a spy. Okay. So one of the things he was doing was running I'm certain he was running some kind of spy ring in Britain, which the journalism was probably a cover for. And then during the First World War, Theodor Reuss goes to work full-time as a German agent in Switzerland and in the Netherlands, so he's completely involved with it. So here's something that's kind of interesting. Before the war breaks out, Crowley had been initiated into a German occult order by a fellow who was also an agent of German intelligence. Now, that brings up a lot of interesting questions. So whether Reuss was trying to recruit him then? See, this is the thing that is it's kind of maddening in trying to sort it out, but it's also the fascinating part of it, is that where does the distinction between the kind of private occult activity and the intelligence activity, where does one begin and the other one end? And that's never clear. They're really sort of the same thing in many respects.
Yeah.
And then also, if you keep in mind, whether it's the OTO or other groups like it's this thing that I have found over and over again, not just in the case of Crowley, is this overlap, this puzzling but very consistent overlap between what roughly might be called occultism or occult activity in organizations and intelligence, and the link in many ways is that both of them deal with secrecy.
Mm-hmm.
So remember, the basic goal in intelligence is to acquire secrets and to protect secrets. That's what the whole thing's about, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to find out the other person's secrets, and you're trying to keep them from finding out yours. Well, what do essentially secret initiatory, what happens when you're initiated into the OTO? Or, let's just take it simpler. What happens when you're initiated into Freemasonry? What are you always told repeatedly? You don't talk about the secrets of the organizations.
Yes.
So that's the common denominator between them. This obsession with secrecy. And the methods which are employed in keeping secrets in one realm work seamlessly in the other. So Crowley had this connection to a German secret order, which in terms was connected to German intelligence, and that, I think, is the key to what made him useful
Right.
to the Admiralty. Because what it allowed him to do, he had a certain amount of credibility in German occult circles, which then translated into credibility in German intelligence circles, because when Crowley shows up in America in the fall of 1914, and then he really very quickly sort of insinuates himself into a thing called the propaganda cabinet, which was sort of the German secret committee for organizing propaganda and activities in the U.S. And one of the things that was kind of, again, is puzzling is that, well, are they really that stupid? I mean, why would you bring someone in from the outside? Okay, he's a foreigner. He's trying to pass himself off as being an Irish revolutionary, because in 1914, if you wanted to prove that you were anti-British, you just had to say, I'm Irish.
Yeah.
But nobody believed that. I haven't found a single actual authentic Fenian in New York who had anything to say about Crowley. So he's sort of, pretending to be this, Irish nationalist, and he might have been able to convince some Germans of that. He seems to not have been able to convince anybody Irish of that. So, but the real secret to it is that who is it that the Germans in New York, which aren't that stupid at least, what are they going to do? They're going to check back to Berlin. They're going to find someone, and Theodore Royce vouches for him.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because Royce may actually, knowing the details of what, Royce may have thought that he had recruited Crowley or that he could use him in some way, but they actually they're in contact, at least intermittently, through the early part of the war. So that, I guess, in a nutshell, explains the connections between Crowley's prior activities in the occult realm and then how that made him useful. He knew the right people who could, in a sense, he had to kind of with the Germans, and he was then sort of taken into their group in New York and managed to infiltrate that quite successfully. And what he did thereafter was pretty simple. He simply sat around and listened to them talk, may have influenced them, and then passed on everything to the British consulate.
Right.
But then you keep in mind, it also, from the British intelligence standpoint, one of the things that you want to do, one of the things that you must do, is to maintain Crowley's credibility among the Germans, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which means that you can't publicly say anything good about him. And in fact, when, let's say, other agencies like MI5, which existed then, which is the sort of counterintelligence, if they come along and they start sniffing around about Crowley and actually get it into their heads that he is a traitor or might be one, well, you're not going to dissuade them from that at all. I mean, what would better attest that Crowley is truly loyal to the fatherland than the mere fact that his own government is branding him a traitor?
Yeah.
So that's this kind of, I would argue in his own way, this kind of devil's bargain that Crowley made. And if he didn't sell his soul in doing this, he sold his reputation that he could never redeem thereafter, because it would never be acceptable for you could never explain how all of this came down.
Now, you call one of your books is Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley. We can obviously know where the 666 is. Did he have a longer-term involvement with British intelligence after World War I? And indeed, did he have any involvement in World War II?
Well, there's of the many sayings that you come across in intelligence, one of them is, a little plain. When it comes to those matters, you're either a virgin or you're a whore.
Right.
So, once you have been introduced, once your virginity once you have signed on, then you can be utilized later on. It comes down to this fact that the reason why he's now keep in mind, in terms of basic term, Crowley is not really an intelligence agent. Certainly not an officer. Remember, he never is employed by. He's not a full-time employee of any agency. He doesn't hold any military commission, even a gentleman's commission. He's an asset.
Yes.
Okay. This is what you do. So this is what someone like Fielding, or probably someone above Fielding, did, is that they recruited him as an asset. And what that means is that this person can be useful.
Uh-huh.
And as long as they're but it all depends, how long you can be useful and in what regard. So pretty much having been, it's something else that I explain in the book Secret Agent 666, is that Crowley's at least incidental work for intelligence probably began before the First World War. I don't think that it entered anybody's head in 1914, because you can find him doing a whole variety of things prior to that. I think at one point around 1906 or so, he takes this kind of, I don't know, I guess you could call it a vacation, a long hike along the border of what was then China and French Indochina, which was in the process. Not only was that an area of boundary disputes and of colonial rivalries, it was also fast becoming the main opium growing area in the world at that time. And, Crowley sort of takes a trip through this area, observing things, and then stopping along the way at every sort of British consulate or whatever would pass for it, and sort of, and having a conversation with people there. And what that sounds like to me is that he was on an observe and report mission, and he was going through, seeing what he could see, and then giving periodic reports.
Mm-hmm.
Which is really exactly what he was doing. Now, did that just happen occasionally? Was that just one of those things that just happened? Or was that what the whole purpose of that was? So, since he was probably had some connection before, was one of the things that helped his recruitment during his use of him during the war. It didn't always go according to plan. So, for instance, sometime around 1922 and 1923, Crowley seems to have screwed up badly. And that was in Sicily. So that's when, those of people out there who know his career, he founded a kind of spiritual commune in Cefalù in northern Sicily. And, that's pretty much what you would call today. He took a farmhouse, fixed it up slightly, and then would invite a lot of people to come and crash and have sex and drugs. I'm sure there was more else going on, but there was a lot of sex and drugs. But I think that's what drew most people there. And what eventually happened is that during this time, Mussolini came to power, and Italian authorities had become sort of suspicious of this weird Englishman and his weird foreign friends who were, horrifying the locals in northern Sicily. And so eventually they move in, and he is arrested and expelled from the country. But one of the things in the Italian reports on this is that they noticed that when we were going through his stuff, we found paper, we found British intelligence papers. Okay, we found documents from the Foreign Office. Okay, that were in his possession. And unfortunately, they never describe what these say, but they do find these documents that he'd left lying around. All right. Because that's the only way that they could find. In other words, let's put it this way. If he has anything that could link him to intelligence or anything to the British government, including the consul in nearby Palermo, and they found correspondence between both of them as well, it should never have been left around for the Italians to get their hands on, and they did. And that's why for most of the 20s, Crowley sort of goes from the intelligence standpoint into the wilderness.
Right. Can't be trusted. Yeah.
Yeah, look, and one of the reasons why that happened was he was following more and more under heroin addiction.
Yeah.
So, look at it this way. You're an intelligence officer. You're sitting in an office in Whitehall or wherever you're, buried under London, 2,000 feet, wherever wherever it is, and you're looking at this guy who's worked for you in the past, and here's this whole thing that's happened in Italy, and the guy basically has gotten so stoned and discombobulated that he became careless dealing with papers. If it wasn't there was an embarrassing exposure of the fact. What did it expose? That the British were spying on the Italians, which I suppose the Italians already knew, but it's one of those things that you don't want to have revealed. So at that point, we don't want to have anything to do with him.
Yeah.
So one of the things you'll notice if you look at Crowley's life is that really from this period from the early 20s up until the end of for most of the 20s, he's basically living in exile in France.
Mm-hmm.
Italy, but he spends most of his time in France, where he's sort of living as a resident foreigner until I think it's 1929 when the French kick him out. And why do the French kick him out? Because they believe he's involved in espionage. Okay. Why would they possibly believe that? Because he almost certainly was involved in espionage of some kind or another. I mean, it's one of those things that if you just look at the incident on its own, okay, if you don't, if you are kind of unaware of his activities during the First World War, his activities before, then the accusation that appears in the press in 1929 that the French have kicked him out for spying, well, I've never heard about him spying. The French just must be, deluded in some way. This must just all be some sort of, horrible, silly mistake. But if you look at it in the broader perspective, you see that, no, this is just the kind, it's sort of part and parcel for him. And even if he wasn't engaged in espionage, it would tell you why the French, who, again, weren't dummies about these things, would assume that he was. And why would they assume that? Because they knew that he had been a spy for the British before. And by the way, in the late 20s, French intelligence is obsessed with the idea that the British and Germans are colluding against them.
Mm-hmm.
Which they were. So, anyway. Yeah. Or that basically the British were sort of sharing information with others against French interests, and therefore, you find out that you've got this former British spy who's sort of living in your country, plus the fact that he seems to be creepy, might be a reason to manage to get rid of him. And then what happens after that is that he's, there's a fellow by the name of, JFC Carter, who's sort of this guy. He is essentially connected to Scotland Yard, but is also the liaison between what's then MI6 and Scotland Yard. Mm-hmm. Sort of meets with him in Belgium and says, well, if you'd be willing to do some work for us, you could come home again.
Mm-hmm.
And that's essentially what he's offered is a ticket to be able to come back home and live there, which he really wanted to do. But first, there's some work that needs to be done in Berlin. And then you've got Crowley, who sent off to Berlin in the period around 1930, and what's going on in Berlin in the early 1930s? Why would anybody be interested in that? Well, the Weimar Republic is collapsing, and the Nazis are rising to power. Okay, yeah. There's this whole sea change which is taking place in Germany, and therefore having someone who, again, has certain connections to the kind of underside of. See, this is the other thing about occult organizations, is that if you look closely, a lot of fairly important people in business and politics are connected to them.
Yeah.
So by having an entree into an esoteric order, you can then have an entree or some connection into the other realms in which its members are connected. So Crowley's there, and that's what he does. I mean, this is the one thing that he actually admits being paid for. And so he was there supposedly spying on, the IRA, probably spying on Soviet activity, and of course just keeping, again, observe and report,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you're in late Weimar Berlin, which seems to have been a pretty interesting place to be.
Yep.
Probably could, and you talk to people, you meet people, you listen to what's going on, what's the temper of conversations, what do people seem to be worried about, and you report on that. It's actually fairly fairly simple stuff. And they follow through on that. When that mission is over, when Berlin becomes a bit too hot for Crowley and leaves after 32, he eventually finds his way back. So in the 1930s, you find him back, living in Britain, getting his, weekly packet of heroin, never having a lot of money. But notice the fact that he is never without a roof over his head. He's never without a meal.
Mm-hmm.
He's never without his heroin.
Mm-hmm.
So someone is paying the bills, and that person is not Aleister Crowley. And, you can always say, well, his friends are giving his money, which, may have been true, but he doesn't have a lot of friends, and they don't necessarily have a lot of money.
Yeah.
So he also has a lawyer, which I've always found to be interesting in this period. He can somehow afford an attorney. And so actually, I think it's in the mid-30s, around 35, that Crowley actually becomes an undischarged bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
So, he has no assets to speak of, but nevertheless, he'll live for another 12 years, maybe in a kind of genteel poverty, but he will not lack for the basic necessities. So, that continues right up to World War II. When the Second World War breaks out, the Second German War breaks out, I think it's in September 1939 that he remembers, getting a note asking him basically to come to the Admiralty and see this person. And he's actually given a phone number to call, and I think the phone number goes to a fellow by the name of something like Captain Lang. I think the fellow's name is Lang.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he's given a phone number to call at the Admiralty, and you eventually need to talk to this person. And so I was very interested. Now, one of the things we historians do is, have I got a phone number? Well, whose phone number is that?
Yeah.
And see, those little details can be important. And so I had a friend whose apparent hobby was tracing phone numbers in the Admiralty or from places. Okay, and in terms of who those would go to.
Yeah.
And this is why, people who have what appear to be, some kind of obsessive compulsive disorder can come in so handy. And sure enough, what this was is that the office, that the guy that Crowley was told to call was the office in essentially the Naval Intelligence Division that handled interrogation of prisoners of war.
Right.
And that's fairly interesting. Because one of the other things that Crowley had some experiment. Okay, in his occult pursuits, one of the things that were involved in that was the use of drugs of various kinds.
Yeah.
And heroin, by the way, wasn't one of them. So supposedly, the way that he actually fell into heroin addiction wasn't because he particularly liked the drug, but it had been used early on as a treatment for asthma.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. There's something else. Crowley had asthma, and I didn't know that heroin was given to children to treat asthma, but apparently it was. So, and then addiction ensues. But no, his favorite drug, by the way, was ether.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, sounds to me like one tiny step above huffing gasoline.
Yeah.
But, which I admit I have not tried, but nevertheless. So but the other thing that he experimented with, again, as far back as the First World War, were with what we call psychedelics, especially with mescaline.
Yeah.
And he was known to, one of his little, things that sometimes I think perhaps annoyed people, was that he would invite them for dinner and, he'd fix them, let's say, a nice curry, something kind of spicy.
Yeah.
And then he would dose it with mescaline, and then he would record, and he would keep notes on this. He would keep notes as to how much he had dosed and the sort of ages, relative weights and conditions of the people eating, and then how they would react to it. So this is a kind of scientific study that he's making of the effects of mescaline on people of different genders, ages, body types, which always brings up the interesting question as to why he was doing that. Was he just doing that for his own amusement?
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to what this will do to my friends, and so I'm going to try it. Or was that something that had some application beyond that? Now, the thing that's interesting is that when you then get up into World War II and thereafter, I mean, you can take this on into, the CIA's MK Ultra, where what are they interested in? Dosing people with drugs and see what happens, right? Let's give them LSD and see what happens, and so mescaline was used. By the time we get to the Second World War, it was used. It was used by the Germans, by the British, even by the Americans, in early sort of attempts at interrogation. The whole idea here was whether or not you could create a sufficiently altered state in the subject which would break down their inhibitions.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the whole sort of truth serum thing. I'm not sure it worked particularly well. And then it gets kind of intriguing because, maybe the most famous or infamous POW that Britain held during the Second World War was Rudolf Hess. Okay, Mr. Crazy Nazi who flies the plane, crashes it, and then okay.
Yeah.
And so, but one of the things that Hess complained about, which, nobody pays much attention to because he's crazy, right, is that he claimed that the British were dosing him with what he called Mexican brain poison, which turns out
to be mescaline.
Which turns out to be mescaline.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, here again, I would simply point these things. Crowley, on his own initiative apparently, experimented with the effects of mescaline, and he had done so apparently for years. Mescaline then was used in the Second World War to some degree as an aid in interrogation, and Rudolf Hess, who was interrogated, claimed, maybe he was delusional, maybe he wasn't, that it was being used on him.
Once again, a big thank you to our guest, Dr. Richard Spence. We'll have the second and concluding part of the interview next week. Now it just remains for me to say, this is Charles Christian saying, thank you for listening in. Please join me again next week. Until then, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.